Hey everyone, and welcome to another installment in our Halo implementation series. With me today, I have, you know what I'm gonna say at this point. I have my favorite person at Halo, Mr. Halo himself, the legendary legend of all legends, Mr. Morgan Aspinall. So, hey, how are you doing, Morgan?
Hey mate, how's it going? Actually, some customers have started catching on now. I've had a couple of occasions where I've hopped on a call and they've said, "Oh, it's Mr. Halo." So yeah, word is spreading.
Absolutely. Your reputation precedes you, right? Which is great.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
I can't
absolutely.
complain.
No, exactly. And I'll always say that about you, mate, because of anyone I know that knows Halo, you literally are Mr. Halo. So and always appreciate you helping me with these videos. So today we're going to talk about agreements, what they are, when to use them, and then we're going to follow on with that to talk about some labor billing, which we'll probably do as a separate video, and then talk about billing plan combinations. And this is following on from what we did last time, where we specifically talked about recurring invoices. So in this one, we're going to say, what is an agreement? How does it work? When to use them? All of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is advised that before we dive into agreements, the previous video has been watched because it's very important that we're building on what we've discussed previously. And so without further ado, let's jump in. So let me share my screen.
Absolutely.
So we saw in the last session the concept of our recurring invoices. It's important to bear in mind that what we were referring to there is nothing more than invoices for products or services, like licenses and so on, to be billed on a scheduled basis. However, the other component to that would be the support side. So you might sell licenses, you might sell hardware. You probably also support that hardware and support those applications. And it is the agreements that allow us to specify that labor time on tickets would be consumed by the allotted time that you have agreed with the customer. So we set our agreements up in our agreements module, where in here, of course, with everything else, if you want to create a new agreement, click new in the top right.
Yeah. And while you're doing that, I just wanted to say, so like for for anyone that's coming in from Autotask or one of those other tools, this is basically what we're talking about here is contracts. So it does it pretty much the same way, but instead of having recurring invoices, Autotask, for example, would have services, and you'd attach those services into the contract. But the contract is really where you're going to be billing that labor. You're going to be billing, setting your SLAs, determining, whether an SLA is included or not, that kind of thing. So this essentially in Halo, an agreement is the contract side of it, and then that eventually ties into the recurring invoices.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Cool. So I like to think of further to that point. I like to think of agreements or contracts. I mean, the phrase agreement/contract in Halo is interchangeable. So I like to think of agreements in Halo as recurring invoices with some additional information sort of wrapped around them. And that additional information, as you mentioned, Chris, might include the SLA that's applicable to this agreement, the number of hours each month that's included in this agreement, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So we start to build that all out by populating the details from the details tab. So first and foremost, we pick our customer. We pick our unique agreement reference, or we let Halo generate one for you. We pick our labor type here. So agreements can have two different labor types, fixed or prepay. Fixed labor type is use it or lose it type functionality. So if our labor type is fixed, then what we will find below is we will find this hours per period option. And this hours per period is going to say how many hours per period are covered by this agreement. So you might have an agreement with a customer whereby they get 24 hours of support included. But as soon as you go over those 24 hours, you go into hour 25, then time thereafter for the month would be billable. And then it comes to the end of the month and that resets and they've got another 24 hours. And if the customer doesn't use those 24 hours in the month, then it just gets reset again next month. That's not something that's going to be carrying over, let's say.
And when you mentioned per, so you were just about to go on to that. So when you're mentioning the per period, that's that labor period, right, where your mouse pointer is at the moment. So that is X amount of hours per month, per year, per quarter, whatever it is.
Yes, yeah. It's also worth noting that if the agreement is an all-you-can-eat agreement, then you've got this unlimited checkbox here, which just means that it is all you can eat. The other labor type is prepay. We'll come back to this shortly. Effectively, our prepay agreements allow us to add in prepay records into the agreement, and that might happen one-off, or that might happen on a recurring basis. And then what we can do with that as well is we can have those hours carry over to the following month. So it might be that we set up a prepay agreement that tops the prepay bucket up by 4 hours each month, and one of those 4 hours actually carries over to the next month. So just to sort of add a buffer in there, but we'll see how that looks.
So that's basically block hours or blocks of time, whatever it is prepay.
So let's set up a fixed agreement. Let's set our labor period as monthly. We'll see here we can set a start date and an end date of our agreement. So obviously start date would default to today. The end date can be either a number of periods. So again, we might want a 36-month agreement here. So I can just put 36 in there. It might be that we want to specify an end date. Again, being a bit more flexible as to precisely when the end date will occur. Or no end date. So the agreement is just rolling on in perpetuity. Below those options, we have our contract type field. So this is effectively the category of agreement. I like to think of these different agreement types as your sort of your managed services, your VoIP, your backup, those different types of agreements we would have as options in here.
And this is reportable. So this is basically then you can say, hey, I want to know how much revenue I've made on gold managed services contracts, or how much our silver contracts are costing us, which ones are unprofitable, that kind of stuff.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And the options in this drop down are configurable, and we can set those in configuration, billing, contract types. You'll notice here it says contract types. Agreements in Halo used to be called contracts. There are, there's the occasional phrase here and there that you'll see referred to as contracts. It means they are the same thing. And we can see that because the drop downs in here are the drop downs that we just saw on our agreement. So we can set up new agreement types or, make use of the existing ones. Cool. So again, for sort of further clarifying exactly what type of agreement this is, we have our subtype here, where we can specify managed, unmanaged. I believe that those options are in advanced settings. Let's have a very quick look. So maybe not. It might be that those are hard coded. Not 100% sure where those options are actually coming from, but that's because I've never had to go beyond this. Managed, unmanaged tend to be the most commonly used.
And those aren't required fields anyway. So, it's not like you have to absolutely fill them in. If you want to leave them out, then leave them out.
Correct. Yeah. And below that, we can specify an SLA to be attributed to tickets when this agreement is the agreement that has been added on to the ticket in question. And then below that, just a couple of options around the PDF template, the email address to use for sending the agreement. It's probably worth mentioning before we go any further, just to touch on that topic, because this is a question that comes up quite a lot, whereby people are looking to find a way to send the agreements out to their customers for signing. Now, we don't do that because the signature portion of the process happens at the quotation/proposal stage. So we'll remember in previous video, when we were going through the CRM flow, we saw the ability for customers to sign proposals. And we also saw how from the subsequent sales order that has been created, we have the ability to perform those actions on sales orders, one of which is to create an agreement. And we'll probably come back to this when we start looking at some more worked examples, start to end process type sessions. But in there, we'll see how we start with the op, we sign the proposal, and then from the sales order, we create the agreement. And then that way, while the signature isn't on the agreement document, it is all linked back to the original signature that the customer signed. So yeah, just wanted to highlight that. Cool, so we filled our details in, click save. And that's our agreement created. Now, an important consideration point here is we've just created our agreement, awesome. However, there is another very important step that we need to take to make sure that we're actually getting paid. Now that is create our recurring invoice, right? So in the previous session, I said that it is very important when creating your recurring invoices to set your schedule, because if you don't set your schedule for your recurring invoice, you never get paid. Well, similarly, when you're creating your agreements, you want to make sure that you're creating recurring invoices for them, because again, if you don't, you're not going to get paid. There are fringe cases where you might want to create an agreement as a container for information, but not have an associated recurring invoice. But for the majority of use cases, you will want to create a recurring invoice when creating an agreement.
And I think that's an interesting thing to think about here, is that the agreement itself doesn't do any billing, right? You have to have the recurring invoices attached to that agreement in order for it to do any kind of billing. Right? And I see this quite a lot as people set up agreements and then go, well, why is nothing billing? And that's because they haven't added the recurring invoices element to that, and then also haven't set up the schedule so that it goes and actually bills on a monthly basis. So bear that in mind, when you're setting these things up, is that it has to have recurring invoices in order to do the billing, because that's actually what does the billing, so to speak.
Yeah, because I believe in Autotask, as you said at the start of the session, I think in Autotask, what we call recurring invoices, Autotask calls contracts.
No, so, they call that services. So
right,
you basically, it's the same thing. You can set up a contract without services, but it's about as useful as a chocolate teapot, because it's kind of, it does nothing. It doesn't bill anything. You need to have the services, and those services then will be billed, and invoices will be created from those services. So I guess it's the same thing here. This is just a shell, because in here we said all labor is included. So we're gonna track all the labor against this, but we're not actually going to bill the 365 or backup or antivirus or whatever against this. We're not going to have any labor element. We're going to have nothing as it stands right here until we add recurring invoices to it.
Yeah. So similar to how you would want to consider adding services to contracts in Autotask, you would want to consider creating a recurring invoice against an agreement in Halo.
Yeah.
Now, what I like to, and this option that I'm about to mention should be enabled by default in new trials, but for older versions, you might find that you need to go and enable this feature that I'm about to mention. And that feature is to automatically create or automatically open up the recurring invoice screen upon creating an agreement. Because I completely see where people come from when they're like, okay, I've just created this, so I now have to remember to go over to my recurring invoices tab and click new. That's not going to happen. You know, I'm going to go through, I've got my accounts team creating 200, 300 contracts, 300 agreements. They're not going to remember to do that every time. So what you want to make sure you have enabled is an option in configuration agreements or configuration contracts, whereby you have this option here, create new recurring invoice after creating an agreement. So we'll turn that on. We'll go back to our agreement section and create a new agreement.
Yeah. Now, while you're doing that as well, just to bear in mind, if you tick that box, it does it actually whether you select prepaid as well or not. So at this point, you actually don't need to create the recurring invoices for prepaid because that's a slightly different agreement type. And that builds the blocks, but that thing still pops up for you to create the agreement schedule when you have you know, prepaid blocks as well. So,
and that pop-up that you're referring to is what we're about to see in a moment.
Yeah.
Notice how this time when I click save, we are automatically redirected to the recurring invoice schedule screen. And this should be a familiar screen if you've just come from watching the previous video around recurring invoices. It is exactly the same configuration here. Couple of points to note. The schedule for the recurring invoice has been inherited from the start date, repeat period and end date for the agreement. However, they don't have to be the same. So you might have agreements set up whereby the customer has 90 hours each quarter of support included, but that is billed monthly. Or they've got 240 hours over the year, but it's billed monthly. So you can make sure that your labor period for your agreement is yearly, annual, but then when you're creating your recurring invoice schedule, you can change that to monthly. So just because we're inheriting that schedule doesn't mean they must necessarily be the same.
No.
And then beyond that, this is just the recurring invoice screen. So everything that we saw in the last session is applicable here. The only difference really is we have this agreement option that is not NA, but is in fact the agreement that we have just created. So again, we've got our schedule set up. We can add our additional lines. I might want to add any items issued to this particular document when it's sent, this particular invoice when it's generated. I go in, I add my recurring invoice lines. So I've got my business premium, 6 of those, got a SSL cert as well. Save that, save that. And that's it. So that's it in its most basic form, at least. So we now have our agreement, and from that we have our associated recurring invoice. So yeah, I think that's a good place to leave this as an introduction to our agreements. When we come back and have a look at agreements in a bit more detail, we'll start to see the application of our charge types tab, our assets and users, our periodic history as well. This is an important one. But it makes more sense to come back to these once we have an understanding of the other side of billing in Halo, and that is labor billing that we will be covering next.
And before we do that, though, just one thing to mention, and I've heard this a couple of times, so it'd be good to get your take on it. But with the prepaid, we can add prepaid without having an agreement. So yes, we do prepaid hours and having prepaid as part of an agreement. My understanding was that the prepaid under an agreement is now the new way to do it in Halo, and not using the the prepaid the old way.
Sure.
Can you kind of explain the reasons we would put a chair under the
Yes, absolutely. So we haven't covered prepay yet. So without sort of, I'll try and be as general as possible. We will take a look when we're looking at billing. You know, over the next few videos, we will take a look at prepay. But to provide some context there, before we didn't always have this labor type option in agreements. When agreement functionality was first developed in Halo, all agreements were only of type fixed. There wasn't an option in here. However, we did have prepay functionality, and that prepay functionality was set at client level. Now that works fine, and actually we'll see when we come back to prepay, we'll see that all of the options in the client level prepay tab, everything in here is actually the same as everything we see in the prepay tab for an agreement. So let me very quickly just create a prepay agreement. Save that, get redirected to my recurring invoice schedule screen. I'm just going to close that quickly just to demonstrate that our prepay agreements have this prepay tab, and this prepay tab has the same information as what we saw a moment ago at client level. The difference is the client level prepay is singular. One client could only have one bucket of prepay time.
Yeah.
So, however, that, you know, so we couldn't really handle cases whereby, you know, a customer, an MSP's customer has got several different buckets of time that are all chipping away, but do need to, you know, carry over to the following month, let's say. So to handle the ability for one customer to have multiple buckets of prepay time, we added the functionality to of prepaid agreements, which is basically taking everything that we had in here and moving it
into agreements.
Into an agreement. Yeah. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And it, you know, that question gets asked a lot. I normally just direct people into the agreements to set up prepay when they set those up.
Yeah.
You know, because then everything else is tracked as part of that agreement. But there are, you know, there is that other option where you could just use it from the client level at that point. So yeah, we will cover that off.
Yes, yeah, for sure. We will have a dedicated session to prepay, and we'll see how it's almost identical when setting it up at client level as when setting it up in an agreement. And I would also agree, for the sake of consistency, I would use, instead of adding prepay at client level, which is more of a legacy method of adding prepay, I would create an agreement of labor type prepay and use it in there instead. Just because of that point of, you know, maybe at some point in the future, you'll need to add a second bucket of prepay time in. At that point, you don't want to have to look at the client level and in an agreement. You want to have those two agreements in the same place, and it just helps with the understanding and keeping things consistent.
Yeah, and that happens with me quite a lot, because I do a lot of prepaid billing, and so from my point of view, it's much easier to do it this way, because then, you know, when we run out of the bucket of time and they top it up, I can just go into the agreement and just add, just increase the extra bucket, and just go into the prepay record and add new bucket. So yeah, it's so that's the way I'd always recommend it. I just knew I had that question a couple of times. People have asked me, so I thought it would be good to put it out in videos so that everyone looking at it will kind of you know, hear the same thing. So but no, I really appreciate it. That's a great video, and as you say, good place to leave it. And I think what we'll do on the next video then is we'll cover off labor billing. So we'll talk about, you know, how to bill for that, and then you briefly touched on the charge types and yeah, billing plan combinations and stuff. So we'll talk about those on separate videos as well. So thank you very much, Morgan. Really appreciate it. And as always, appreciate Halo allowing us to do these and, you know, letting me borrow your time. So really appreciate it. And look forward to seeing you on the next video.
Always a pleasure. Yeah. Thanks, Chris. And thanks everyone for watching.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.